Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about ethical decision-making models. So as usual, let me just sort of situate this week's material in the context of the course. We've reviewed personal values and ethics. We've reviewed professional values. We've read and sort of thought about the code of ethics, although that's something we're going to continue to do. We've reviewed sort of the professional development of ethics in social work. And now what it's time to do is really start applying this information. So this week, we're going to cover a number of different models of ethical decision making. And then your discussion for this week is a chance to start to think about one of these models, or a couple of these models in particular. So we'll wrap up our lecture information today with a little bit of information about the discussion. So what I want to cover first is some ethical decision-making models that are covered in the reading, and then we'll cover a few that aren't in the reading. This is, I realize you can't see all of this. This is from, this says covered in the reading, Catone and Klaus, and this is their 2000 article that's in your reading list for this week. And they cover 8 or 10 different steps in the ethical decision making process that were developed in the 80s and 90s. The thing I like about this table, and this table is available in that PDF document, you can take a look at it a little bit more detail if you want. What I like about this table, though, is that they sort of line up all of the steps that are similar or the same across these different ethical decision-making models. So the first one, for example, is some variation on identify the problem across all of these. And as you can see, Ray, Fournier, and Roberts don't really have an identify the problem. Their first step is really gather information. But let's cover the Corey and Callanan model real quick, because I think that's one of the more basic ones. The Coreys have also done quite a bit of writing in social work, so you'll encounter those names again. But they identify the problem, or the steps in ethical decision making is identify the problem, identify the potential issues involved, review the relevant ethical guidelines, obtain consultation, consider possible and probable courses of action, enumerate the consequences of those various decisions, and then decide on a best course of action. So that's a pretty basic and fairly short ethical decision-making guide. And like I said, the rest of these are sort of all variations, kind of on a theme. Forrester, Miller, and Davis, for example, they work in counseling, not social work, but their steps are identify the problem, apply the American Counseling Association Code of Ethics, determine the nature of the dilemma, generate possible courses of action, consider consequences, evaluate selected course of action, and then implement that particular course of action. And if for example, this was an ethical decision-making model that resonated with you, you could simply replace ACA Code of Ethics with NASW Code of Ethics. But the rest of these are fairly similar. Typically identify the problem, identify the ethical principles involved, review the guidelines, consult with others, pick your course of action, and then decide on a course of action. A couple of these over here, let me just move myself real quick so we can see all of these. A couple of these over here have evaluate the course of action, monitor the course of action, reflect on the course of action, and I actually think that's a pretty important step in ethical decision making, is evaluate the course of action and reflect on the experience. That can be done in the same step or in two different steps. But we'll come back to that here in a little bit. So here's a number of potential ethical decision-making processes. Let's move on to the next slide here. This This is Mattison, who was also writing in 2000, and her ethical decision-making steps are not identified so much as steps, but a pyramid. And again, it's similar to the others that we reviewed on the previous slide. It's just depicted pictorially instead of enumerated by a course of steps. So you gather some background information. You separate practice considerations and ethical components, identify the competing values, identify which which principles in the code of ethics bear in the case, identify courses of action and determine those outcomes, assess priority, make a decision, that's what she means by resolution, and then implement the decision. So again, very similar to the others, just sort of depicted a little bit differently. Let's cover a few of these that aren't necessarily covered in the reading, or let's go over a few of these that aren't necessarily covered in the reading. This is a fairly well-known ethical decision-making model in social work that was developed by Dolgoff, Loewenberg, and Harrington in 2005. And the way this ethical model works, it's again, there's a pyramid, and this this tells you which ethical principles should be valued more than others. So, for example, the protection of life is valued above everything else. The protection of life is valued above equity and inequality, above autonomy and freedom, above least harm, above quality of life, and so on and so forth. And so the way that you use Dolgoff, Loewenberg's, and Harrington's model is this helps you determine which ethical principle to favor. So if, say, autonomy and freedom is in competition with privacy and confidentiality, autonomy and freedom sort of triumphs over privacy and confidentiality. So you would choose autonomy and freedom as the correct course of action. Elaine Congress was also developed another ethical decision-making model, and I always like this one because ethic is the what do you call this? The letters in ethic corresponds to each of the steps. So the E stands for evaluate relevant personal, societal, agency, client, and professional values. T is think about what ethical standards the NASW Code of Ethics applies, as well as relevant laws and case decisions. H is hypothesize about possible consequences. I is identify who will benefit and who will be harmed. C is consult with supervisor and colleagues about the most ethical choice, and then after that you obviously would implement that particular ethical choice. This one, I think, though, it's sort of easy to remember because, like I said, ethic corresponds to each of the beginning of the enumeration of the steps there. Moving on, a couple more not covered in the reading. This is Strom and Gottfried. This one's fairly recent. Strom-Gottfried, one person. This was written in 2015. This is the 6Q model, the 6-question model. So, who will be helpful? When have I faced a similar dilemma? Where do ethical, clinical, and legal guidelines lead me? What are my choices? Why am I selecting a particular course of action? And then lastly, how should I enact my decision? And she has a couple of sort of sub-steps there as well, but this is the 6Q model. This is again taken from Mattison's 2000 work, but she believes that ethical decision making should always include reflection. And so reflection is sort of what happens after you select and implement whatever course of action you're choosing. And she sort of outlines that process as well. I'm a little less concerned that the ethical that the reflection process is diagrammed, because social workers tend to be pretty reflective people in general. But at any rate, her this is where reflection falls, sort of beginning and after. Before and after the ethical decision making component, which is right here. So she thinks that we should be reflective and self-aware at all times. We analyze that ethical dilemma and make the appropriate decision, and then continue with reflection and self-awareness. Reflect on a course of action. So there's a few things to remember about ethical decision making, and I've talked about these in other weeks, but I'm just going to stress them again. The first thing I'm going to stress is something I've said before, but it's worth repeating. Ethical decision making is a process. It requires time and thought, and it really requires us to be to sort of do our diligence in that process. It's not a technically demanding process. It's not like a math problem or setting up a computer program. I use that analogy for a reason. I'll come back to it in a second. It's not a technical process, but ethical decision making is demanding of our emotional and intellectual energy. So it's taxing in that regard. The other thing is listed in this third bullet point here. There is no one right answer. What we do in ethical decision making is identify really the best answer, the answer that maybe is the most correct from a number of correct answers. We identify the best answer from a number of potentially good or right courses of action. And so in that way, it's also unlike a math problem or setting up a computer program. Math problems and setting up computer programs, for example, have one right answer to get to. We're trying to converge on a single right answer. This is not the case in social work. There's a number of potentially correct answers. There might also be a number of potentially wrong answers, and our job really is to select the best answer, and that's what this process of ethical decision making guides us to. The reason why an answer then is the best has to be communicated to a client, to a supervisor, to a colleague. It has to be documented, so on and so forth. And then the last thing to remember here is this last bullet point. After the decision is implemented, it requires monitoring, evaluation, and reflection. So again, I can't sort of stress enough that ethical decision making is really about the process. It's not about the outcome. It's not about the right answer. It's about sort of engaging in the process. Let's cover a few criticisms of ethical decision making here real quick, and that's what this says here. I'm just going to leave myself. Well, why don't I put myself here? So there are a couple of criticisms of ethical decision making that you should probably at least be aware of. Ethical decision making hasn't gotten a lot of empirical scrutiny in social work. So there's very little study of which models social workers use. We haven't really interviewed or surveyed social workers to figure out which ethical decision-making process they tend to use. There's very little study of which models produce the best outcomes, and there's very little study of which models produce the most benefits for clients. Now, let me pause here for a second. This is these two, so the criticism that there's little study of which model produces the best outcomes and little study of which models produce the best benefits probably is not a big deal. And that's because all of the ethical decision-making processes that we've covered have a lot of overlap. They're sort of generally the same. Some of them break steps up. Some of them add a few other steps. Some of them explicitly include that reflection process, but they're all sort of generally the same. And so they probably all produce similar kinds of outcomes and similar kinds of benefits, but we can't say that for certain. And what we don't know is which of these social workers like the most, which of those models social workers like the most. And so what we're left with is sort of the dozen or so ethical decision-making models, as opposed to one. We're left with sort of a dozen or so ethical decision-making models that I've shared with you here today. The lack of empiricism on this bullet point now is concerning, given the increasing emphasis of empiricism. In our profession, I mean, we're an empirically based profession. We have to show justification for our outcomes and efforts, and so that's a concern as well. There's also some criticism that ethical decision processes prioritize protection of workers over client well-being. Ethical decision making, in theory, should benefit clients and protect the worker. That doesn't always happen. Then there is some disagreement over what constitutes an ethical dilemma. And there are some minor criticisms that models don't apply in modern context. You'll notice that the most recent model I shared in this lecture was from 2013, and that was before the 2017 addendum to the NASW Code of Ethics. I suspect this is going to change after that 2017 update. It just takes a little bit of time for those articles to be written and then published. Nevertheless, I think of the criticisms of which you should be aware, this is probably the one right here, the sort of lack of empirical evidence. I sort of listed these from most concerning to least concerning down here. Lastly, let's talk about this week's discussion, and let me just move myself so we can see everything. So your task is to review the ethical decision-making models talked about in the reading and in the lecture. Then your discussion question for this week is to identify a couple of similarities between them, and then pick one that resonates with you. It can be any one that's either talked about in the reading or mentioned in the lecture, or both. There are also others out there. If you're interested in others, you could look for a different one. And then tell me the reason why it resonates with you, and this will become sort of the ethical decision-making model that you take with you going forward in our course. Remember the timeline and expectations discussed in week 4. I think this post can probably be done in 250 or 300 words or so. And then remember, towards the end of the week, your task is to respond to at least 2 of your colleagues. But this week's discussion is really in service of our goal for this week's material, which is to obtain some beginning familiarity with an ethical decision-making model. Again, that model is which model it is completely up to you. There's an awful lot of similarities between them, but like I said, your goal is really to become familiar with one of those models and sort of become familiar enough with it that you're able to sort of take it with you moving forward in our course. Okay, that's it for this week's lecture. Thanks for watching.